Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marian Marsh. I'm Senior Development Officer for Scotland for CoMoUK, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to our webinar this afternoon, the Scottish Mobility Forum, the role of shared transport in delivering a greener, healthier future for Scotland. We have over 150 people signed up this afternoon, which is great. And I'll just start by telling you a little bit about CoMo. CoMoUK is a charity promoting and supporting shared transport. We've published the UK's first guidance on mobility hubs, a suite of resources for planners, an online CPD course for planners, quality standards for mobility hubs, and an accreditation scheme. And we'll be sending out links for those after the event to you. It's an exciting time for mobility hubs in Scotland at the moment, and we feel that mobility hubs can help deliver the MPF4s, position statements, outcomes, zero emissions, wellbeing economy, greener, better places, and resilient communities. We're also delighted to see inclusion of mobility hubs in the Strategic Transport Projects Review 2, considered by Transport Scotland, and we look forward to moving forward to a network of hubs in the future with high design standards and each tailored to its own location in Scotland. Today we're going to hear about the role of shared mobility in new developments and how they can encourage active travel and reduce car dependency and also improve health and well-being in the public realm. We have a number of speakers this afternoon. We're going to start with Irene Butermann, who was convener last year of the RTPI Scottish Executive Committee and planning for place manager at the Improvement Service and Public Health Scotland. And she'll be talking about planning places for people and for equality, specifically as well, health and well-being. We'll then move on to a joint presentation between Sam Shaw, a landscape architect from Rayburn Farquhar Bowen, and Michael McCarthy, an architect from Collective Architecture. And they're both going to talk jointly about their work together with the City of Edinburgh, working collaboratively on a new development on a regeneration site at Meadowbank in Edinburgh. And then to finish, we have our own Scotland director, Lorna Finlayson, and she will talk about mobility hubs, specifically looking at our recommendations for design and the sort of components that can go in these so that they are tailored to the location and the communities where they are placed. And she will also be talking about a future vision of how these things can move forward in Scotland. We will then be going into a Q&A session, and I will explain in detail about that later, but you will have an opportunity to put your hand up and speak to the speakers or to use the chat box, but we'll look at that in detail later. And we'll move on now to start our programme. So our first speaker, our keynote speaker, is Irene Butermann, and I'm really delighted to have Irene here today. Irene is lead on planning in place at the Improvement Service and Public Health Scotland, and she's highly experienced in place-based collaboration, which is a theme I'm sure we're all going to have to get used to working with. Irene's work is about planning places people not only want to spend time in, but where they can make lifestyle choices that promote physical and mental health. Irene, would you like to come and join us now to speak? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to join you this afternoon and to begin with some reflections around the future of planning in Scotland and how shared transport can help deliver that future, specifically around the new national planning framework that we'll have that is guiding and shaping what will be happening in Scotland to 2050. So an important document. And that I'll touch on 20-minute neighbourhoods, and I will most certainly be touching on place place-based approaches and the role of place-based approaches and the importance of shared transport in all of those approaches as well. So as it says there, I work at both the Improvement Service and Public Health Scotland. And just to be clear there, public health is about that preventative level of health. Health is about going into hospital and getting treated. In Scotland today, we have far bigger issues around those kinds of illnesses like heart disease and diabetes, where it's prevention that actually cures us. You can't go into hospital and come out cured of diabetes. It's something further up the line that will lead to that. So working between local government with the Improvement Service and public health in order to pull those two together into that place-based working and collaboration. And I'll be doing that now as a joint role starting in April. So today, as I say, I'm going to have a look at the key outcomes from the National Planning Framework. We had a position statement came out in November, and we're expecting a draft of it coming out at the end of this year. At that point, it'll go into Parliament, and we'll all have a chance to comment. So it's important to keep an eye on what it's about and what are those outcomes. And with that, then keeping an eye on that shared transport and the role of place in those outcomes and how well served they are by the requests and the expectations that we have of that National Planning Framework. So to begin with, we're hopefully all aware we have a new Planning Act in Scotland, and it was very much informed by our National Planning Framework, which puts well-being above growth in the sentence in the middle of that flower, which I'm delighted at. I would prefer if we just talked about inclusive economies, and I think that's a direction that we're going on in Scotland. But when that Act came out, we were very much attuned to those framework outcomes, and we were aware that we had a climate crisis to deal with. So we ended up with an Act, though, that had a set of new outcomes, and I think that's the exciting part, if an Act can be exciting, of our conversation today, is planning is changing its emphasis. For decades where I've worked in planning, every national planning framework was about delivering growth, and it would put a different adjective in front of that, of green growth or sustainable or inclusive, but it still used that word growth rather than having an economy that just serves people and planet. So the new outcomes that have been required by that Act are crucial, I think, to shaping how we think about our places and how we deliver on these outcomes using places and the role of shared transport in that. So the new outcomes are around housing, the delivery of housing, especially for our ageing population and for disabled people. It's about delivering health and well-being. We have a set of national priorities in Scotland around that. They're not just Public Health Scotland's priorities, they're every organisation's priorities to be delivered upon. There's an ask in there about rural depopulation and reversing that and repopulating rural areas. There's a requirement now of planning to deal with equality, to look at how it achieves equity. Scotland is abysmal, really. It has the worst health inequality in the whole of Western Europe. Depending on where you live, your healthy life, not when you die, but how long you'll live a healthy life before you end up spending perhaps decades in ill health, there'll be a difference of 26 years depending on where you live. That is a planning issue, because it's the places that we live, that we work and that we play in that are having that impact on us, and we need to equal that out and not have that kind of gap. Then there's an ask within the Act that the National Planning Framework take account of climate change. And then finally, there's also an ask around a more positive effects for biodiversity as well. So I'm excited about those new asks. We had those already grounded for us, and a new kind of interest in what are we doing in planning and planning policy to deliver on that well-being of people and planet, rather than purely be about the delivery of growth. Then, of course, COVID hit and we had to get on with that. And that has sparked in our programme for government a new interest from our government in a 20-minute neighbourhood. To be clear, I mean, there's something on the Improvement website, a briefing on this if you want to look into it more. It's about local living for our daily needs rather than getting too hit up on that 20-minute figure. So where we are now with the National Planning Framework is, as I said, they came out with a position statement in November, and it slightly concerns me because there's now 4 key areas that it's focusing in on, but there's a very strong focus on climate, and that is understandable, but I think, and I would urge you all to remember that there are other outcomes there. It does have an ask to consider more about these local living and the daily needs. So I think that is promising because that's an important part of how we think about our places. Apologies, my dog has just started barking, so sorry. I'll just move on. So why this matters to us is because if we don't think about all of these different outcomes and it's put me right off my line, that, sorry. If we don't think about the interventions that we're making, especially when we're thinking about planning and when we're thinking about the different aspects that we intervene in planning, then we can end up having unintended consequences around what we do. So this quote always captures it so precisely for me, where obesity, inactivity, depression and loss of community has not happened to us. We legislated, subsidised it and planned it. We didn't mean to do that. There was no intention there. We've gone in with an intervention in one level or in one area, and it has ended up impacting poorly for other areas. And I think it's important when we think of transport, when we think of how we deal with our climate change crisis, that we don't go in with an intervention purely to deal with carbon emissions and don't think about the impact on people and their health and their well-being and biodiversity. And a well-known example of that I quote frequently is spending the same amount of money on inputting electric charging points across a country in order to enable the electric cars and the reduction of carbon emissions. But if you spent the same amount of money on active travel, you would get the same reduction in carbon emissions, but you would get 30 times the improvement in people's health and well-being. That's 30, not 13. 30 times. So we need to think about the whole place when we're going in and making interventions. So an overall desire to deal with the climate crisis is important, but it's important as we move forward and we think about how we do that, that we think about those other areas and we are collaborating around that. So that role for shared transport and place and what we can be doing is those areas of what makes up a place. So for every place you have that physical environment, and that's very much what planning is in there, shaping and managing. Then you also always have the people who are in that place, working in it, moving through it, and the connections that they're making. And then we always have that economy, and that isn't just economics or growth, that's looking at that street and where people live, people are working, people are spending money, it's all of that. And then more and more these days, we have the online aspect of a place as well. So just moving forward very quickly into the kinds of areas that I think we really need to be considering when we're looking at a place and we're looking at how do we do that place-based approach then, is if we look at what others are doing in, say, Melbourne, where they're looking at a 20-minute neighbourhood, they're using that term. You can tell I'm cautious of that term. But it isn't just about what you can reach in 20 minutes. It is about a full realm of what we need to be providing: good quality, affordable housing, and safe places as well. It's about quality rather than purely a walking distance. And I think for Scotland, we're very fortunate that we already have an identified set of themes in the police standard that have been evidenced and mapped right across to what Scotland has already evidenced and identified across to what Melbourne are using and what other countries across the world are focusing in on as being the important aspects that matter when you come to a place. It wouldn't surprise you to know that transport and how we move people around is critical in that. So those, for Scotland, what I'm working around within Public Health Scotland and the Improvement Service is a set of place and wellbeing outcomes in those themes of we need the overlapping between movement, between the spaces, green spaces, urban realm. We need to think about the resources, the local shops, the housing, what kind of housing. We need to think of civic, the sense of belonging and a sense of pride in a place. And then we also need to think about that stewardship. Do we feel we have an influence as a community over a place? And then bang in the middle there, what is very important is people and different groups of people. All of these themes that I'm working around map across to show how you can improve a health outcome. And I've chosen there moving around purely because of the topic today. It's about behaviour change. That's what we're really about. How can we shape the environment to change people's behaviour? Because telling them what's good for them to do, we all know, we try that, we keep at it for a few weeks. But if we don't embed it in our own behaviour change, then it's a much bigger struggle. And if we can embed that kind of behaviour change of people being more active because they're walking locally to services, if they're able to go a short walk up to get to public transport, to get to somewhere where they can park their bike and get onto public transport, then they're much more likely to make that the habit of their day when they need to go beyond that daily requirement for a local shop and so on. And it maps right across to treating just those diseases that I was talking about earlier. So that's just showing it maps through each one of those. And in every case, it impacts on all of the diseases that we're dealing with right now, that we're living with. We're dying of them, but we're living with them as well. And that's a really big impact. So the place and wellbeing outcomes, the national planning, the national outcomes themselves, and the need to think about different people and our different groups in our communities. If I can keep those three areas for you as being a focal point for how we move forward and how we collaborate and how we think about local, but how we take that up to the regional scale, that everybody choosing to live out in the countryside but driving off past my house at the top of the road in Christopherton to get into town. That's not fair on me. If we all live more locally, get our local needs, and then when we do need to move and travel further, which we always will, we do that in a sustainable and active manner as possible. We've done a couple of bits of work on this, and I just wanted to very quickly at the end here highlight, we've basically scoped out these place and wellbeing outcomes, and we did some work with Edinburgh around their local development plan. And one of the findings around that was, I'll just go back to that, was around the importance of travel and the impact that has. We need to get densities right so that people will stop being car orientated and will get out and walk to local shops and give the critical mass to support bus and public transport as well. And that impacts greatly on equalities as well, because it opens up job opportunities to everybody. Not everyone can work from home, as we've all been lucky enough to do. It opens that up for them on a lower income to be able to get there, because we can't all end up driving around in electric cars to solve this climate crisis. Most of us couldn't afford an electric car right now. A third of households don't have any car at the moment, and when you go into the deprived areas of Scotland, that goes up to half of all households don't have cars. We need solutions that don't involve cars as well, and we need to be thinking of those. More locally, we did go in as well to the Ardrossan and have a look about that impact on a town centre and getting that kind of walkability through a site and making sure that when we're really down at the nitty-gritty level, and we'll be coming on to that, I think, with the next speakers, that we're thinking about all of those themes and how they all interact. That is a closing one around, and there isn't time to read it, but I'm sure that the slides will be shared afterwards, of a finding about the importance of getting density right if we are to be encouraging the frequent use of public transport, car clubs, bike sharing schemes. It's important that we get that right, and that is down to planning to be able to do that. Our final rapid scoping that we'll be doing is at a far higher level out in Argyll and Bute, the whole of that area and all of the islands. We did that last week, and the write-up will be coming shortly. That is a whistle-stop tour, as you can tell, of what I'm doing. And the lasting message there is we need to think about all the aspects of a place and all the different parts of a population group. And that will help us to actually meet our own national framework outcomes, as well as the outcomes that are set there in the national planning framework. Thank you for your time, and my dog apologises for its barking.
Thank you so much, Irene. Wow, what a lot of information in a few minutes. Really, really encouraging to planners, I'm sure, and a lot of collaborative working to be done. And what stunning statistics as well. And that cartoon, you know, that's going to stick with me, that cartoon of people driving through an area and saying, well, it's all right with you guys if I pollute your area on my way to work, sort of thing. My word, there's so much that impacts from one planning decision. Thank you so much. There's a lot of food for thought there, and I'm sure other people like me are going to watch those slides again. Thank you. We're now going to move on to our next presentation, which, as I mentioned before, is a joint presentation between Sam Shaw and Mike McCarthy, landscape architect and an architect that have been working jointly with the City of Edinburgh on Meadow Bank. I first went along to Sam's office, he'll remember this, just over a year ago, and we were talking about how we could perhaps put mobility hubs, hublets, definitely shared mobility, into this development in the best creative way to create the best environment. So I'm really interested to hear how things have moved on in that year or so. What I'm going to do is in a minute, I'm going to hand over to Sam. And I just want to mention that he is also at Rayburn Farquhar Bowen. He's known as the active travel champion, and I'm sure that's going to come through. When Sam has finished his half of the presentation, he's going to hand over for me to Mike. So I will just add that Mike has worked at Collective Architecture since 2019, and before that he worked in London for both private developers and local authorities. And we very much look forward to hearing from both of you. Thank you. Sam, can you join us now? Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Marian. Welcome everyone. This is a joint presentation, so me and Mike are going to walk you through the Meadowbank People Prioritise neighbourhood. It's going to be a whirlwind look at what we've done so far, and knowledge share of some of the challenges we've faced, and an explanation of some of the ideas that we've incorporated. This project started out as a review of the car-dominated master plan that had been submitted for the Commonwealth Games site surrounding the new proposal for a sports centre, which you'll probably be aware of. The original application was submitted in tandem, and it was refused planning in principle. It wasn't quite right for the site. This was where Rayburn, Farquhar Bowen and Collective came in to come up with something more appropriate for the housing element. It became a different project in its own right from the sports centre. As you probably know, Meadowbank sits to the east of the city centre, and it's got fantastic links to local shopping areas. It's got good transport links, with Waverley Station being about a mile and a bit away, and there's great big areas of open space. So Holyrood Park is you can literally jump to it from the site. So it's really got quite a good connected network. It is, however, half landlocked by two railway lines, which poses some connectivity issues, especially northwards to the community of Restalrig, which was a very important part of how we approached the project. And it's clear that from the start, this project had to be economically viable to support the principle of development on the site. The approach to our planning needed to tick all the boxes when looking at Edinburgh's policies and guides, so that we could look at designing for a net zero carbon city by 2030. We were from the start getting stuck into figuring out how we could do that and how we could design a neighbourhood that encourages active travel. It was suggested during a preliminary conversation with a friend that we should investigate a low car approach, which sounded pretty difficult at the time. It was quite new and quite green to that kind of idea. But he said, you know, design an exemplar project that people come to Scotland to see, rather than us designers going abroad to go and visit Verna neighbourhoods in Holland or other places in Europe that have a low car approach. So we started looking at how Edinburgh's structured and reviewed the council's proposals for controlled parking zones, and we figured quite quickly on that these are going to be expanding quite rapidly fairly soon, and eventually it's going to encompass the Meadowbank site. Public transport links through the buses are good, city centre short walking or cycling distance away, and we expect segregated routes to the city centre are going to be improved as more people choose active travel as a result of carbon reduced lifestyles, and as a response to the freedoms that they've discovered during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's become more important for people to walk and wheel about the place. We set about our brief to develop the master plan via a pretty intensive community-led process. Now, this has been an 18-month period of community consultation, so it was really important to kind of understand what the local contexts were and how important they were to people. Ecology and landscape was a guiding principle from the start, and this kind of supported the fact that we wanted to incorporate around about 600 net zero carbon homes, 35% of which would be classed as affordable. Community and commercial space was also part of the brief, and we again considered ways that this community space could support healthy lifestyle choices through an active travel and community hub. And this grew looking at how we would approach minimal car parking, safe and attractive and really well-connected walking and wheeling routes. We assessed what it meant to design for people who want to live in a low car environment and what they might need to support that change. I think we can all see from what's happened over the probably past 10 plus years, where the networks of getting from A to B and the facilities at B, so work, shopping, leisure destinations, are all improving. We're getting more segregated cycle routes, more spaces for people coming through over the last year. But at A, we're kind of failing a little bit. You look at new housing and it's a continued rollout of home designs that favour car ownership, and all the streets just prioritise vehicles. So this was where we kind of decided to look at Meadowbank as point A. Instead of designing wide roads, fairly marginal pavements and homes with driveways for cars, we looked at what it would be like to put a community first and put active travel as the first choice of transport. This means doing things a little bit differently. So homes that prioritise storage of cycles and wheeling aids, integrated maintenance and active travel support within a community hub. People prioritise routes that actively deprioritise vehicles, and car share there for the times where you're going to need a car, because people generally still have that need in their life at some point or another. And a focus on the 20-minute neighbourhood, which Irene has mentioned before. And we know that Meadowbank's got the potential to support that. As we said, the local Meadowbank retail park's close by. We've got Piers Hill, which has got a big shopping area and independent shops along Easter Road. And the east end of the city centre is 1.5 miles away. All the green space is close by. And we've also got the incorporation of a health centre along with everything that's on offer at the new sports centre. So from this, our master plan developed as a series of people prioritised streets with a focus on integrating climate adaptive green infrastructure, which is the kind of exciting part for me, integrated with these walking and wheeling routes. It's really important that we look at active travel routes as corridors that have more than one function. So plan to move people, water, wildlife at the same time. Get the benefits that comes from having rain gardens to manage your water flow, tree planting that gives you shade and protection, and pollinator friendly planting that increases that enjoyment. We want people to enjoy being in Meadowbank, and we want these streets around their homes to be nice places that they want to dwell. Our model for the site represents how the development responds to the high-rise tenements to the south and the lower-rise housing to Restalrig in the north. Again, shading views was an important part of that, and that was well fed back through the consultation. And how the streets look was also important. Not having big 6 or 7 metre wide roads with 2 metre footpaths either side meant the designs were actually much more economical, rather than having these huge, great big construction depths for massive vehicles. We were able to kind of think along the lines of more human-friendly surfacing to encourage people and discourage car use. And this fed into looking at how streets could be designed. And we want to still support the use of vehicles because we've got the practicalities of bins and fire and deliveries, etc. However, it doesn't prioritise them over people. We want the streets to feel comfortable, for people to feel overlooked so that they feel safe, and for them to be practical. And also suit a multi-generation and multi-ability use. So incorporation of rest areas and tapping edges for people who have mobility issues or visual issues is quite important in that concept design. And tying into what Irene was saying, we want to enable behaviour change from the doorstep, make walking and wheeling the most convenient choice. So I'm going to pass you over to Mike now, who's going to take you through the rest of the presentation and explain some more about the concepts that we've incorporated.
Hi everyone, and thank you, Sam. So following on from what Sam was saying, just a brief introduction. So I'm from Collective Architecture, and we're based in Edinburgh and Glasgow, for those of you that don't know us. And we do a lot of work in the residential sector and also kind of a lot of community-based projects. So Meadowbank is a really interesting example of some of the work we've been doing recently. Following on from what Sam was saying, looking at, I guess, strategies at street level, we're moving on to look at some of the site-wide strategies. And we don't have time to cover everything today because it's quite a complex project. But hopefully I can go into some of the specific strategies and projects, particularly focused on active travel. So the low-car strategy was developed with the active travel team at the City of Edinburgh Council and supported by Sustrans. We created a hierarchy of road surfaces and pathways, as you can see from this diagram. So in the blue line, this sort of denotes the site entrance, which is also shared with the sports centre adjacent to the site. And it's a busy junction directly off London Road. And we're proposing an entrance, sort of turning and drop-off zone for all vehicle types in this particular location. Then beyond this area, the dashed line denotes the sort of gateway zone. And this is a narrowing of the roadway, indicating that vehicles are now entering the people priority area. And I'll pick up on this on the next slide. And the orange lines and the red lines are the shared surfaces, where people have priority over cars. And that's people, that's pedestrians, cyclists, and people wheeling as well, and in wheelchairs and so on. And the red areas are where emergency vehicles are required access as well. So just moving on. So this slide just shows, so where cars enter the gateway area into the people priority zone, there'll not only be a narrowing, but actually a change of road surface. And at this point, we're proposing to have pedestrian cycle count monitors as well to measure the success of the pathways. And long term, there are opportunities to look at the entrance junction to London Road, which is very busy, one of the main arteries into the city centre, and how this junction basically interacts with the cycle paths and the wider network. And we've discussed with Sustrans making this potentially a signalised junction with a designated cycle lane, creating safer environments for cyclists and vehicles too. So in terms of the parking levels, this is kept to a minimum across the development, with an allocation for 22 blue badge bays and 6 city car club spaces. Now, we discussed and got assistance from CoMoUK on the number and location of these, and we tried to locate the car club spaces as close to the entrance as possible and near to the active travel hub, which I'll come on to. So we try to embed lots of ideas, of active travel ideas across the development, and these letters, kind of A to K, sort of symbolise a sort of list of projects that we had. And these varied from site-wide ideas like street enhancements, supporting the people-first approach, to individual projects like the Active Travel Hub. We also looked at areas out with the site boundary, so identifying opportunities for improvements to existing cycle and pedestrian networks. And these were also issues that were raised through our public consultation process as well. Essentially, we tried to propose interventions at different scales, city-wide, development-wide, right through to individual homes. This approach will hopefully have a positive impact, not only on the residents, but also the local communities, leading to a much more connected place. And the aim of all these projects ultimately is to help support the low car, low parking strategy. So in terms of the People First street enhancements, one of the major projects is an area called Wrestle-Rig Rain Gardens. This project seeks to improve connections to Wrestle-Rig along the newly reinstated Clock Mill Lane, which is one of the main routes through the site, negotiating a steep 5-metre level change. So the aim of this project was to make it an accessible route for pedestrians and cyclists. And the proposal creates a sloped rain garden with a ramped footpath, providing access for both pedestrians and cyclists alike. And the pathway will be well lit, signposted, and incorporate benches and play features to animate the space. And the rain gardens themselves and the landscaping will provide a sort of attractive backdrop to that. So this slide sort of shows two areas out with the site boundary that we identified for improvement. On the left, this shows an area called Clock Mill Lane, which is adjacent to the main site entrance. And this is a rather dark and a gloomy, congested road with insufficient lighting, signage and delineation. And there was an opportunity to sort of redevelop this roadway to improve the paths and links to the city centre, which would also help our site. And on the right side is an image of the junction called Smoky Bray, which is called a sort of local nickname. And Smoky Bray was a point of contention at local consultation, with residents concerned about pedestrian safety, with narrow pathways and cars travelling at great speed. So we suggested a few traffic calming measures and also raised this with the council. Now, these were improvements that were already on the council's radar and the active travel team at the council. But in raising the ambition for the Meadowbank site and thinking beyond our site boundary, the priority of these projects has also been raised. And the council and Sustrans, I believe, are now actively pursuing these independently. So we are also aiming to provide 200% cycle provision across the development, which is above policy. And we aim to provide a whole range of different bike stalls, if possible, to accommodate the various vehicle types available, from your standard bike to cargo bikes for families, to trolleys and various other bikes available. And the design of individual homes will hopefully be designed in a way that considers cycle use, making sure there's ample and convenient storage within the entrances to accommodate bikes, helmets, carriers. So there's real opportunity to make sure active travel is embedded in every aspect of the development, site-wide to individual homes. So in discussions with both Sustrans and CoMoUK, we identified a potential location for an active travel hub. And it's currently identified as next to one of the new public squares that we're proposing, which is at the heart of the site, really. And the square is also located adjacent to London Road. And within the development, the ambition is that the hub will promote active travel and provide not only services, but a social space for the local communities. And off the square, we've already identified other ground floor unit spaces for community use as well. So the intention is that the hub would include bike hire options, library initiatives, secure bike storage, as well as repair and maintenance facilities. And the hub would aim to improve links to public transport and local path networks by providing travel information and associated outreach activities. So locating the hub on the square and adjacent to London Road also hopefully gives it a sort of presence and would make the hub more of a destination, not just for the residents, but to attract people from the wider communities as well. So I've kind of touched on this, but we identified 3 potential locations for bike share schemes as well, which we would further connect the Meadowbank site with the city centre and also the local communities, and one of which is based right next to the active travel hub. Edinburgh already has the Just Eat bike scheme, which seems very successful, and so the Meadowbank site could really benefit from using a scheme like this as well. And yeah, I think, as I mentioned, we touched on earlier, we identified a location for car share, and it was very helpful talking to CoMoUK on this and sort of identifying, the provision suitable for the number of residents on the site. And in locating it next to the sort of entrance gateway, it sort of limits the impact of cars as well. It reduces the sort of distance that cars have to travel into the site. And so whilst we're encouraging people not to have cars, we also appreciate that there are times when one is required. So car share is there to support the residents as well. So in summary, the Meadowbank proposal aims to support co-mobility by embedding active travel at the heart of the development. And the various projects discussed have helped to enable the low car, low parking approach. And we've listed out some of the key lessons learned, I suppose, on this slide. And I won't read this word for word, but the key messages are, I guess, the need to think differently in a world responding to climate change. Being ambitious is important as a designer, and designing for minimum parking, acknowledging that creates opportunities for enhanced public realm, community and green spaces. It's not just about increasing the density of buildings. And, not only are we aiming to create enhanced infrastructure, but also create greener and safer streets, and which helps to meet Scotland's net zero targets. So it's using policy wisely, and, as policy is your friend. Seeking help from funding from the right people, and the active travel projects are ambitious currently, but they do have support from Sustrans, and they've offered funding to develop these ideas through to detailed design. Finally, the car is not king. It may take a long time for people's sort of perception on this to change, but amenities like car share schemes, as well as active travel hubs, can help to provide an alternative solution. So in terms of the next steps, the Edinburgh City Council are currently seeking a development partner and hope to bring as many of these ideas to fruition as possible. So thank you for listening today, and I will hand back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sam and Michael. That was great to hear in detail about your joint work, and fantastic with all those drawings and photos. We really see the improvement from the original, more car-orientated ideas for Meadowbank. Really, really good to see as well, all that cycle parking outside people's homes rather than drives and garages. Real contrast. Thank you. So having heard about place planning, and now having looked at designing a specific site, we're now going to look at CoMoUK's vision for Scotland with examples of good mobility hub design or quality standards and accreditation from our Scotland director, Lorna Finlayson. Lorna, can you join us now, please?
Thanks, Marian. Thanks very much. Yeah, so I think what I wanted to do was just give a brief update on mobility hubs from a CoMo point of view. So our definition is up there on the screen for you to see. Essentially a place where public, active and shared modes come together alongside improvements to the local area with enhanced, with enhanced community facilities where relevant. We have been doing a lot of work on mobility hubs over the last year or more. We've produced an introductory guidance on mobility hubs covering the different components, typologies and locations. We've got a suite of resources for developing hubs, specifically aimed at planners and developers that Marian has been leading on. And we've also created an accreditation for mobility hubs to assess the standards. These resources are all on our website. We will share the links for those, and we'll put our website up at the end. We're also working with partners across the UK to develop the first pilots of mobility hubs, and we host regular forums where people can come together and to share best practice. Again, we will share the details of that. So just wanted to bring up that illustration just a bit bigger so that you can see it a bit better. There are lots of potential different features of mobility hubs, from parcel delivery lockers, for car clubs, EV charging points, cargo bikes, bike repair, cafe, planters, seating areas, signage, green space, shared bikes, shared e-scooters. And the list goes on. There's a lot of potential here in terms of the design and what they could contain. We think that mobility hubs have a huge potential to shift behaviours, to reduce private car use and to tackle climate change, because they offer a convenience for multimodal trips, for easy switching between journeys, different choices for different days. They improve safety, especially for vulnerable users, and they raise the profile of a range of modes, including shared modes of course. And they also allow for the reallocation of space from private car to for the benefit of pedestrians and businesses, improving that public realm. So I touched on the typologies. Hubs come in different shapes and sizes, and in our guide we have basically set out the 6 different types of mobility hubs as we see them. So city centre, large interchanges, transport corridors, mini hubs, business parks or housing developments, rural or market and satellite towns, and tourism. And I just wanted to go through, just give a couple of European examples. And so it's been really commonplace in Europe for a number of years. Bremen in Germany was an early adopter. They've built the first mobility hub in 2003, and since then a network of mobility hubs has grown. In 2020 there were 10 large mobility hubs and 33 small hubs in residential areas, mainly like the one you can see here. A study from 2018 has shown that for each car club car has replaced 16 private cars, and there's estimated to the car sharing on offer in the city has removed 5,000 vehicles from the streets. So really positive impact there. Here's an example from Austria. This is Vienna, and it shows just the kind of digital and physical interaction in this hub, and that's run by the company that runs the public transport network in the city. A couple more pictures here. We've got from Berlin in Germany, we've got some quite a few hubs across the city, from micro hubs to larger. This is a good illustration because it's got all the different modes. Here you've got shared e-scooters, shared cars, shared vans actually at the back there, along with the public transport modes and shared mopeds. And then in Linz and Graz in Austria, just an example of some of the car sharing and integration with public transport that's on offer there. Closer to home, just wanted to turn back to the UK. So here is a map from our website of where the mobility hubs are developing in the UK. So you can see there, there's quite a few down in England. And actually there's only one that we know of in Scotland, which is in East Lothian and Musselburgh. And the plans are quite early days, but the plans in East Lothian would be to create a network of mobility hubs across the county. So exciting plans, but it's still emerging. And CoMo is working with quite a few of the local authorities in England to try and develop the mobility hub concepts. You can see quite a few there. There's Leeds, Nottingham, Norfolk, Plymouth, and in London as well. I wanted just to mention quickly about our accreditation. So this is we've developed an accreditation standard for mobility hubs. We see that the accreditation can be used in 2 ways. So firstly, through the design process to ensure that the features are there, built from the very start. And then the second aspect would be about using the accreditation to assess the impacts in the user experience. And we think there are 6 factors for successful scheme design for mobility hubs. There's viability and accessibility, choice of sustainable modes, ease of switching, safety, practical facilities, and a visual, social, and community appeal. And for each of the factors, there are different expectations depending on the type of hub. For example, in city centre hubs will be different requirements compared to a business park or a tourism hub. But through these accreditation standards, we're able to award a bronze, silver and gold for meeting the criteria. And just as an example of this, here it is in more detail. So this is the accreditation standard for a large interchange in city centre hub. And it shows there, obviously, it sets out the essential and the desirable criteria against each of those 6 factors as part of the accreditation. Just wanted to mention a further piece of work that we're doing on mobility hubs, and it's around the business models, business and financial models. We're working with WPI on this. The work isn't yet completed, but I wanted to mention it because I think it's of interest. The potential business models for hubs is quite wide-ranging. What may have once been a public sector-led transport interchange now could have a different range of models with different, a public-private partnership, community-run. There's different models out there that could work. And we're starting to see more of this as more hubs are being developed in the UK. That's what this piece of work is looking at, and we hope that will inform the thinking around hubs can grow and develop. We're about partway through, so there's not much more that I can share at this stage, but just wanted to mention it and just watch this space for that coming out, because I think that's going to be a really interesting piece of work and will really help with people who are trying to develop hubs on the ground, how to actually take that forward and think about the business and financial models surrounding that. And just finally, before we get into the Q&A, because I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions coming up, I just wanted to mention just some of the opportunities as we see them. So to achieve net zero, we need to be innovative and we need to go further and faster now. We are pleased to see that mobility hubs have been included as one of the key recommendations in STPR2, as Marian mentioned at the beginning, and that's the investment plan for transport for the next 20 years in Scotland. We've seen some really rapid changes because of COVID. We've had greater home working. We might see the permanent deletion of some commutes. We might see interchanges used more as community facilities. So there's lots of opportunities actually that are developing, but we need to get there. And some of the things that we think need to happen are embedding hubs in the planning process in NPF4. And that's what Irene was touching on at the beginning of this event. That's part of that. We think hubs are central to 20-minute neighbourhoods in that strategy. We want to work more closely with Transport Scotland on STPR2 in that development of hubs, creating guidance and a framework. But we also think we need to work more closely with local authorities, with universities, the NHS, as well as private developers and communities to try and get more hubs planned for Scotland and building towards that national network of hubs that we feel can radically affect behavioural change in Scotland. Thanks, Marian.
Thank you, Lorna. Yeah, it's just great to hear all in one short talk, all the things that CoMoUK are doing and all the future prospects for mobility hubs. We're now at our question and answer session, and I'd like to invite all the speakers to turn on their cameras, please. Just for those of you watching, just so that you're clear, you can raise your hand to ask a question direct to a speaker or to the panel, and we will bring you on screen. There will be a 10-second delay with you coming on screen. Do not worry about that. We will handle that. But just before we start that, and while you're thinking about putting your hand up and asking a question, I've got one in particular I would like to ask Irene, because all the way through listening to Irene, Sam, Mike and Lorna, the same thing has been going through my head. And that is, Irene, it was just amazing to hear of the many impacts that we almost can unwittingly have as planners when we're planning places. And obviously we don't want to repeat this anymore. And I'm just wondering how we can collaborate across these silos of transport, planning, health and climate, and whether you've got any takeaway for us on that, please. Thank you.
Just a nice easy to begin then, Marian. think the presentations there highlight how we need to work more collaboratively, organisations and across sectors as well. And I think we just need to understand what each other are talking about in a lot of cases. And at times, you know, a very simple one that we're doing right now is we're preparing a paper that explains public health to planning practitioners and land use planning to public health practitioners, and being able to say, you know, we have a shared ambition here. You can come together and work together on it. But it is always helpful to give ideas on how we can do that work together. Planning is such an evidence-based led thing. You know, we need evidence to inform policy. And where is the evidence sitting? An awful lot of it is sitting in Public Health Scotland. And we can make those links so that we can inform the policy. And then, just as the Act is saying now that there's a requirement to assess that impact on health, then we can also work together when we get down to that level. But let's keep it up there at that plan led, and have the kind of policies that planners feel when they're sitting in local government with an application, they feel confident to ask for more, to have a policy for a better kind of a hub, and for the kinds of development that we've just been hearing about, which are fantastic, absolutely brilliant. But I want to see that in every development that's happening across Scotland now. And yes, you know, and I include something, you know, on the edge of a suburban kind of area in the Central Belt as well. There is no reason why it should be getting developed out as a single monoculture of housing that is very car orientated. We should still be looking at those hubs that then take you on beyond, but that we have something more closely related. So we do need to understand each other more. We can support each other. We have that now set out as a requirement in the national planning framework. And if we work together more, then we can be understanding and supporting each other so that there's confident decisions being made in planning authorities to say, we don't just have the policy, we feel confident we have the evidence to back up that policy, so we don't end up down the road at an inquiry and that risk. And there can always be that risk, and there's too many occasions, I think, that we're doing planning in a risk-averse kind of culture of, should we really ask for that? We need to have the evidence that we are very confidently asking for these things, and it's sitting there and it's just linking up and getting working. Give people the thing to work together on. That's how they collaborate. Simply telling them to go and get in a room together and collaborate doesn't work. That's what they can begin to work around.
Thank you, Irene. Just to mention to people, if you do prefer to just put your question in the chat, that is absolutely fine. We've got a couple of questions in. Just bear with me a minute. But there's a quick question here from Caitlin, who says, has there been any research into other developments that provide car sharing schemes and the breakdown of who accesses them? She says, I still think there is a behaviour change that needs to happen, and committing to live in a development like this could indeed be quite daunting for a family, say, that's always had a car. Could a trial scheme ever happen? So I think I'll just answer briefly this one on myself and we'll move on. So it's just to say, we have on our website, you will see that we have our annual car club survey. It digs down into how people use the car clubs and who uses them. And we have a 2020 report that's published and will be published by the end of the month. So then you can get some news on this rather unusual year that we've also had as well. But yes, it's a good question. We really need to think about this behaviour change. We've got a few questions coming in. We have one here. I don't know who has put this question on. It says, under NPF 4 and 20-minute neighbourhood strategy, and from the COP26, wood bike taxis, can this evolve in the medium and long run? And could we reduce car vehicle ownership? I think what this question is getting at is that, can we use planning policy, 20-minute neighbourhoods, coupled with other policies related to the actual car clubs and so on. Laura, I don't know if you've got any further mention that we can put on that. I mean, clearly we work closely with car clubs, and we also work closely with planners, and it sounds to me like it's talking of more collaboration. Have you any comment?
No, I'm struggling to think of what the answer to that one could be. So might need to throw it open to the panel. I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a lot going to happen. Where there's COP26, I think, is a very good point. I think it's a good opportunity to showcase what's going on, not only just in Glasgow, but in Scotland and the rest of the UK. It's going to be a really important event that I hope can go ahead and happen. I mean, we don't even know what's going to happen with that, but certainly from a CoMo point of view, we hope to be there, and we hope to be showcasing 20-minute neighbourhoods along with some of our partners, the active travel delivery partners that we work with. It's a really important strategy, I think, that the Scottish Government has backed, and we are certainly fully supportive of it. And that's what I was saying. We think that mobility hubs are quite key to that, because it's not about just taking things away and saying, you know, we need to reduce parking here. It's about giving people other options. And that's why, you know, giving people mobility hubs, shared modes in their doorstep, these are the things that are going to encourage that behavioural change. So these are the things that we would like to see. So hopefully that's covered some of that question there. But, you know, if any of the other panel members want to come in, please do.
I think this is a huge area, and what we've all said, and it's noticeable, is that this starts from the minute you walk out your front door. And that's the important aspect, is that we are changing behaviour and giving options for that. Paths for All have done work with another organisation, I've forgotten the name of it right now, you know, that if we decide we're going to walk more, we'll keep to that for about 3 weeks. We're not good at doing it. We need to have a reason for doing that. And COVID has given us that. It's made us all notice the place right on our doorstep. And that's obviously what has really got Scottish Government's attention, saying this is amazing. This has had an impact not just on emissions, but on people's well-being. And we've seen how important it's been suddenly to get told, go out and get half an hour of exercise. We've gone for decades never getting told to do that. And we've all actually done it a lot more and noticed those places. So I think there's a real desire to capture that and to build on it before we all go back into getting into cars. But there's just this huge aspect about the fact that this is a lot of retrofitting. You know, we can see what we're doing with new build, and that's fantastic. But you're right, we do have an awful lot of the built environment that is there. What do we do with that? And that comes down to looking at, you know, what I call, why do I have a lane at the top of the road that is just for storing metal boxes? I have no idea. I don't know why it's there and why it gets the priority that it gets, while I have to squeeze past people on the pavement. So we need to look at the biggest space in an urban area is road space at the moment. And we need to look at reallocating that space to people, to mobility, to hubs, and to stop putting, you know, it's quite simple things like bikes, where you park your bike. Why is it on the pavement? It should be taking up a parking space, not blocking the street for somebody who's visually impaired and forcing somebody who's wheeling or in a bigger group to actually walk around it. We need to reallocate that space and think quite carefully about exactly what's the purpose. It is to reduce that reliance on the car. So let's start to cut that amount of space as we move forward. But it scales up, and it's interesting. I was very interested in what you said about work in rural areas as well, because I think hubs in rural areas, that would be, I'd love to know more about that and be promoting that in my own work.
Thank you, Irene. Sam and Mike, I am going to turn to you soon, but I've got one of our viewers now, Catherine, waiting to ask a question from the floor. So, Catherine, would like to hear your question, please.
Well, thank you very much, and fantastic convening, as always, super interesting and amazing people to listen and learn from. The question is really a follow-on to Marian's discussion about the question to pose to put people in a room together. So the transport is a network. So by networking, I totally agree we will get traction. But one of the problems is you have private sector competition with wanting to develop hubs because of the return from electricity sales or car sales. And you have the other side, which is our desire to meet our net zero targets by 2050, which involves councils across the countries, our countries. So the question, and a lot of the focus is on new, which doesn't reach those who already live in long terraced Victorian houses, and neither does it reach those in transport fuel poverty, although it perhaps does better with high rise. So the question is, how can we get local authorities, parish and district authorities, not-for-profit agencies like the National Health and the Health Trusts, who have a huge transport carbon footprint, together with community organizations responsible for renewable energy, which are therefore linked into those electricity networks that drive transport, or will do in the future, or partly. How can we get them all to think of this in a system, a network across the UK? And part of the answer is already in the room. It's you planners. Planning is 60% of the project, isn't it? So, you know, it is possible if everybody gets in the room and shares that vision, which I think we do through the structures that, you know, the policies that have already been mentioned on this call. But it seems, for instance, in my local council, the transport plan is not until next year, where or because of COVID it was delayed, whereas the climate plan is this year. So those just don't marry. So that's the challenge. It's the public-private sector division, and it's the marriage of the different organisations' planning frameworks themselves. So how do we get those people to share that vision and move forward?
Thank you, Catherine. Yes, it's an important point. I wonder if any of the panel would like to make a reply on that one. Yeah, I think it's more for you, Irene. Thank you.
Okay. In Scotland, to be fair, it is what we're doing. I mentioned when I was talking about our public health priorities in Scotland, they haven't been defined by the National Health Service. They've been defined by our Scottish Government and COSLA, who represent all of the local authorities. And they are an ask of everybody, particularly the public sector, to think about all of their policies and what they're doing to deliver on the real priorities for health in Scotland, because of that terrible health record that I spoke about earlier. So we are actually on our way to doing that, and we do then have a national planning framework coming forward that is being asked to think about health again for the first time in decades. You know, planning began out of a need to build because of health, because of poor health, but then it was diseases, and we moved people apart. The diseases are different now. We've cured all of the TBs and the things like that. We now actually need to think about getting people moving, so they're physically active and they're having social contact with other people and with nature. So the links are there. Roles like mine, roles where people are coming together. There are examples in Scotland where we have people from the local health board being seconded into spatial planning, and then likewise going back the other way, there have been examples of planners going and working in what was the previous version of Public Health Scotland. For me, that's where we break down the barriers, because we can't help it. We've got our own jargon. It helps us to do our job, but we need to have people who bridge across that. So we need to actively make that happen. Secondments into different areas. I started in Public Health Scotland a year ago, and it's been a real learning curve on health jargon and all of that. But that's what we need to do to get going. But I think we've started that journey. There's just a fair bit to go yet in Scotland.
Can I just add to that, Marian?
Yes, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a designer's point of view, you know, and I'm sure Sam would agree, you're constantly kind of balancing different agendas, and it might be the client's agenda, the local authority, a private developer, the roads department, the cleansing department, and And within the local authority, sometimes there's a bit of a mismatch, even, you know, between certain ambitions and the practicalities of the roads have to be this wide and the pavings have to be just so, and, you know, to certain regulations and so on. So I think from our point of view as designers, it's just about challenging, trying to push things in the right direction, and thinking beyond the site, you know, your own sites as well, to the wider networks and how your site reconnects other parts of the city. So, you know, you've kind of, so there's a broader agenda there, and you're thinking slightly beyond just your individual project. So there's the kind of, that can be our role as designers as well, to try and push things forward and knit together some of those agendas and make them realign if needed.
Thank you, Mike. I've got another question for Mike and Sam here from Cliff Haig. It's specifically on Meadowbank. And it says, some of the Meadowbank illustrations, excuse me, show cyclists sharing space with pedestrians. Many older people or those with young children do not feel comfortable in such spaces, as a minority of cyclists do not respect their needs. Any views?
Yeah, so this was something we considered, and it was important for us to recognise sort of hierarchy of street typology and the difference between areas around homes and active travel links, which we see sort of popping up through our cities. And we took the choice of having streets that people are trying to create with the creation of LTNs, where there are flexible spaces for people to play, to share experiences, to dwell, to be social, as well as get from the main roads to their homes. As part of that, and in one of the illustrations that we showed, we also have considered a separation of a small zone on the street by using street furniture and tree planting to have a refuge area. So for people who want a slower speed that is not going to be dominated by cars, effectively it's more the width of a pavement rather than the width of a road or a street. So we've tried to consider how people who, you know, as I said in the presentation, might need a tapping edge, i.e., you know, the edge of a curb or something, to navigate through streets. And this was something we thought would be quite important, to make sure that people who want a slower speed, as well as the people who want a wider area for play, for cycling through the Meadowbank development.
Thank you, Mike. That time's gone really quickly. We're going to have to round up now. Thank you so much to all four of you speakers. I think we've covered so much ground in an hour and a bit. So thank you very much for the time preparing and all that you've shared with us, and the Q&A, putting us all on the spot at the last minute. Thank you so much. I've just got a few quick announcements before we go. Oh, and I mustn't forget to thank the tech as well, of Dave and Ali in the background, as you'll see, have been feeding me questions and sorting out one or two technical hitches. So thank you so much. Could not have done this without you. Yeah, we have some news for you. We will, as I said at the start, email out links to you all, together with a recording of this webinar. We'll also send out our Mobility Hub guidance, our suite of resources for planners, our CPD online course, which I can recommend, and a number of other resources as well. We'd also like to invite you to our next webinar, which is happening this month on the 24th of March, Buses on Demand, how flexible on-demand bus services can help Scotland build back fairer. So we can look at another mode and how we as planners can collaborate and work on that one. Do contact us if you want any more information. My email is there on the slide. You've got the website, and from that you can contact any of us. And thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We look forward to seeing you again. and we look forward to collaborating further. Thank you, everybody. Bye.